Hi, I'm Claire. And yeah, you heard that right. My cousin's $90,000 engagement dinner was held at my restaurant. She walked in on my floor, looked straight at me standing near the kitchen pass, and told my host to get that line cook away from the tables before she embarrasses everyone. That line cook was me, but that wasn't even the part that undid her. The part that undid her came about 40 minutes later, when her future mother-in-law asked to meet the owner. The drive back to Savannah always does something to my chest. Not the good kind of something. It's that specific wait that starts around mile marker 12 on I-16 and just sits there, pressing, like my lungs are trying to remind me what I'm walking back into before my brain gets a chance to argue. It was a Saturday in late April, one of those mornings where the humidity already had opinions before 10 o'clock, and I'd agreed to come home for my aunt's birthday brunch because I told myself it would be fine. It would be short. I would smile and eat and leave. My aunt opened the door with her arms already spread wide like she'd been standing there waiting for 20 minutes. "Look at you," she said, squeezing both my hands. "You look thin. Are you eating enough? You really should be eating more, with how much you work." She said it the way people say things that sound like concern but land like criticism. I said I was fine. I stepped inside. The house smelled like it always did, gardenia candles, and the particular kind of carpet cleaner my aunt had bought from the same brand since I was 11. My uncle was in the living room watching golf with the volume low. He looked up, nodded once, looked back at the screen. That was about as warm as it got with him, and I had made my peace with that a long time ago. Then I heard her. My cousin came down the hallway in a silk robe at 11 in the morning like she was arriving at a press junket. Her hair was half pinned, her phone in her left hand, and she had that look she always had, the one that said she had already evaluated the room and assigned everyone their position in it. She stopped when she saw me, raised an eyebrow. She said, "Oh wow, you actually came. I thought you always had something more important going on." I said it was good to see her too, and went to pour myself a glass of water. Brunch was set on the back porch with the good plates out, which I noticed immediately. My aunt only brought out the good plates for milestones or announcements. My cousin sat across from me and spent the first 10 minutes scrolling through something on her phone, tilting the screen away when I glanced over. My uncle talked about his car. My aunt passed around a cheese tray. And then my cousin set her phone face down on the table and said she had news. The engagement, she announced, was happening in June. Her fiancé, a man I'd met exactly twice. Both times briefly had a family who was, and she paused here for emphasis, very established. Old money, she said. The kind of people who actually appreciate doing things right. She was looking at me when she said the word right. I kept eating. She went on. The engagement dinner was going to be something significant. A real event, not just a dinner party. She had found the perfect private dining venue in Charleston. Exclusive, the kind of place that got written up in regional magazines. Total cost, she said, was sitting somewhere around $90,000. My aunt made a sound like that number was exciting rather than alarming. My cousin smiled, and then she said it. She said she would need me to handle the financial backing, since I was, quote, the one with the mysterious money situation no one understood. She used air quotes, actual air quotes, with her fingers. Around the words mysterious money situation, like my not broadcasting my finances online, was somehow suspicious rather than just private. She said it wasn't a big deal. She said I could write it off as a family investment. She said her fiancé's family would remember who made it possible. I put down my fork. I looked at my aunt, who was looking at the cheese tray. I looked at my uncle, who was looking at the back fence. I looked at my cousin, who was looking at me like she'd just asked me to pass the salt. I said I'd think about it. She said great, and picked up her phone again. I drove home to Charleston in 2 hours and 17 minutes, and I didn't turn the radio on once. My general manager, Priya, was already at Oleander when I got back. She was reviewing linen orders at the bar top and looked up when the door opened. She took one look at me, closed her laptop, and said, "Which one was it this time?" I said my cousin. She said, "The engagement one?" I said, "She wants $90,000. Priya put her pen down slowly, she said, "and she asked you directly." I said, "In front of my aunt and uncle," with air quotes. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you want a coffee? Or something stronger?" I said coffee. She said she'd make it strong. I sat at the bar and tried to separate the feeling in my chest into parts I could name. There was the anger, which was familiar. There was the particular specific hurt of watching the people who were supposed to be your family look at the tablecloth when they should have said something. And then underneath all of that, there was something older and harder to name. The thing that made me nod and say I'd think about it instead of just saying no, my cousin had never worked for anything she'd kept. She'd started 3 businesses that my aunt and uncle had funded, all of which had quietly dissolved within 18 months. She had a following online built entirely around her aesthetic and her fiancé's family's name, and the particular performance of a life that looked full from the outside. She called what I did the restaurant thing like it was a hobby. She had said once, at Christmas, that she didn't understand why I wanted to work that hard. I had thought about that sentence for probably longer than it deserved. 2 days went by. I didn't call. I didn't text. On the 3rd day, my aunt came to Oleander. She didn't make a reservation. She walked in during afternoon prep, when I was in the back office going over the spring menu changes with my sous chef. And Priya came to get me wearing the expression she reserved for situations that required me specifically. I went out front, and there was my aunt at the host stand holding a canvas tote bag and wearing her good earrings, which meant she had planned this. She said, "I thought I'd come see the restaurant since I've never been." She said it like a fact, and not like what it was, which was an approach. I showed her to a table near the window. I got her water. I sat across from her and waited. She said the space was lovely. She said the lighting was very nice. She said she never realized how much work went into running something like this. I said it was a lot. She folded her hands on the table and said, "You know your cousin has always been a bit of a dreamer." I said I knew, she said, "and this engagement, it's a real opportunity for her. His family has connections. The right kind of introductions could change everything for her. And your cousin," she said, "she doesn't always know how to ask for things gracefully. But her heart is in the right place." I said, "She asked me in front of you, and Uncle David, and neither of you said a word." My aunt smoothed the edge of the placemat. She said, "Well, we didn't want to create tension." I said, "So I'm supposed to absorb it instead." She said, "You've always been the steady one, the capable one. Your cousin looks up to you more than you know." I said I found that very hard to believe given the air quotes. My aunt sighed. She said, "Claire, you have built something real here. You have means. This dinner would mean so much to her. It would mean so much to the whole family." She reached into the canvas tote and slid a printout across the table. It was an itemized event budget. At the bottom, in a box with a border, it said, "Family contribution, Claire's name, confirmed." I stared at that word. Confirmed. Nobody had confirmed anything with me. I had said I would think about it, which is not confirmation, which is a sentence that means the opposite of confirmation. I pushed the paper back across the table. I said, "I haven't confirmed anything." My aunt looked genuinely confused, like this was a bureaucratic error and not a deliberate choice. She said, "But sweetheart, we just assumed you'd want to help. You've been so blessed." I said, "I've worked extremely hard." She said, "Of course you have. Nobody's saying otherwise." I said, "The budget says otherwise." She looked at the table again. I stood up. I thanked her for coming in. I told her the restaurant would be happy to have her for dinner sometime, that Priya could help her with a reservation. My aunt left 20 minutes later. The canvas tote went with her. The printout stayed on the table, and I didn't touch it until Priya picked it up, read it, and put it directly into the recycling bin without a word. That night I was closing out invoices when a notification came through on my phone. My cousin had posted. It was a reel. The first half was a clip of her fiancé, surprising her with flowers in some golden hour light that looked professionally arranged. The second half was a slow pan across what looked like a mock setup for the dinner white tablecloths, centerpieces, the works with a caption that said, "The vision is coming together. So grateful for the people who actually show up for us." The last frame was a screenshot of a text exchange I couldn't fully read but could see, was with someone she'd labeled family support, and the preview showed enough. I set my phone face down on the desk. She hadn't asked. She had announced. And when I hadn't folded, she had reframed my silence as support for her narrative online, before I'd had a chance to say anything either way. I sat in the quiet of my office for a while. The restaurant was closed, the kitchen was cleaned, and the only sound was the street outside a Saturday night in Charleston. Music from somewhere a few blocks over, the kind of city noise that usually calmed me down. I opened my laptop and started drafting a message to my cousin. Something clear, something firm, something that explained without being cruel that I was not a financial instrument available on request. I got 3 sentences in and deleted it. Not because I didn't mean it, because I had been down this road before and knew exactly where it went. She would send it to my aunt. My aunt would call crying. My uncle would send a one-line text about keeping the peace. And my cousin would post something vague about disappointment and chosen family, and her followers would fill the comments with sympathy. I closed the laptop. I went home. I fed my cat. I stood in my kitchen for a long time looking at nothing. The memory that came up wasn't one I'd thought about in years. I was 13. My cousin was 12. We were at my grandparents' house for the holidays, the kind of big family gathering where every room had a different conversation happening at the wrong volume. My cousin had broken a lamp, an old one of my grandmother's favorites, while showing off some dance she'd learned. And when my grandmother came in to see the damage, my cousin looked straight at me and said I had done it. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even flinch. She just pointed at me and let the story rewrite itself right in front of everyone. My grandmother looked at me with that particular expression of adult disappointment. I said I didn't do it. No one asked her to prove it. The holiday moved on. My cousin caught my eye from across the room later and smiled. I had forgotten about that lamp for almost 20 years, but standing in my kitchen that night, I understood suddenly that it wasn't a single incident. It was a template. She had been practicing that particular skill her entire life, the art of pointing and letting someone else carry the weight, and somewhere along the way, I had let myself become the person who carried it without objecting. I went to sleep. In the morning I had an email. It was from my cousin's fiancé's event coordinator. Professional formatting, letterhead, the works. It outlined a private dining booking at a venue called Oleander, my restaurant. My address. My kitchen under a client account flagged as family-hosted event. Cost to be settled by secondary contact. The secondary contact was me. I had never been contacted. I had never been consulted. I had certainly never agreed to be anyone's secondary contact for anything. I forwarded the email to Priya with no message. She called me in 4 minutes. She said, "So she booked Oleander." I said, "Without asking me." Priya was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Nothing yet." I said, "Pull the booking record and flag it as pending authorization. Don't cancel it. Don't confirm it." Priya said, "You're going to let it run." I said, "I'm going to let her think it's running. I want to be precise about what happened over the next few weeks because the details matter." My cousin came to Oleander twice to meet with our events coordinator without knowing I had asked to be briefed after every interaction. She brought a mood board. She requested menu changes. She asked our florist contact to double the centerpiece order. She was, by all accounts, polite to the events team and significantly less polite to the kitchen runners and support staff who crossed her path. She snapped at a busser for not refilling her water fast enough. She referred to one of our prep cooks as the back-of-house people when asking someone to move a floral sample away from the kitchen smell. Priya documented everything and sent me the notes at the end of each visit in a folder she had labeled, with characteristic efficiency, cousin situation. On the third visit, she asked our events coordinator who the owner was, because she wanted to ensure the space was being managed by someone who understood the caliber of client she was. The coordinator said the owner was very involved and would likely be present for the event. My cousin said good. She liked to know who she was dealing with. The coordinator nodded and sent me a voice note afterward that was mostly just a long exhale. The evening of the engagement dinner arrived on a Saturday in early June, when Charleston was doing everything it could to justify the tourism brochures. Oleander looked the way it always looked when we went full capacity, quiet, warm, intentional. The flowers were right. The lighting was right. The kitchen was moving clean. I watched the setup from the second floor and came downstairs 20 minutes before the first guests arrived. I was in the kitchen when my cousin walked in with her fiancé and his parents. I could hear her voice from behind the pass, that particular bright-edged pitch she used when she was performing for people she wanted to impress. His parents were from somewhere outside Charlotte. Old money the way she'd described. The kind of couple that moved through rooms by taking their time. I heard her pointing things out. She said the space was wonderful. She said she had very specific taste and had been very involved in every detail. She said the owner came highly recommended. I stepped out of the kitchen into the dining room floor. I wasn't in chef whites. I was wearing what I always wore when I was present for an important service: dark trousers, a good blouse, my hair back. I was checking in with the floor manager near the service station when my cousin turned and saw me. She stopped walking. Her fiancé nearly walked into her. She looked at me the way someone looks at a smudge on a clean surface, confused first, then annoyed. She turned to the nearest host and said, quietly enough that she thought I couldn't hear, "Why is there kitchen staff on the floor right now? Can someone handle that before the Aldridges see?" She nodded toward me like I was a chair that had been placed incorrectly. The host looked at me. I looked at the host. I gave the smallest nod. My cousin had turned back to her fiancé's mother, reaching for a compliment about the centerpieces, when I heard Mrs. Aldridge ask the question. She said, "The design is beautiful. Who do I thank for it?" And before my cousin could answer, before she could claim anything, Priya was at my elbow, and the ambient music had softened in that specific way it did when I needed a room's attention. I walked forward. I stopped at the edge of the table setting. I said, "Good evening. I'm Claire. I own Oleander. I'm glad you're here tonight." Mrs. Aldridge looked at me. Then she looked at my cousin. Then she looked back at me. She said, "You're the owner." I said, "Yes." She said, "Your cousin has told us so much about this space." I said, "I hope the evening lives up to it." Mr. Aldridge extended a hand and said it was a pleasure. He said, "We don't often get to meet the person behind the room." I said I tried to be present when it mattered. My cousin had not moved. She was standing 2 feet away with her hand slightly raised like she had been about to say something, and the sentence had simply left her body. Her fiancé was looking between us. His expression had shifted from polite guest to someone quietly recalculating something. He asked, "You two are related?" I said, "Cousins," he said. "And she booked your restaurant?" I said, "She did." I let that sentence sit exactly where it landed. My cousin found her voice. She said, I didn't realize she stopped." She tried again. She said, I thought someone else managed." She looked at me and said, "You actually own this place." I said, "From the ground up." She said, "But you never said anything." I said, "You never asked." Mrs. Aldridge made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite anything else. She said, "How extraordinary." She said, "And the menu tonight, you designed it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "We're going to have a wonderful evening." She said it to me, directly, not to my cousin. She said it the way a woman who has spent decades reading rooms says things, with precision, with finality, without cruelty, but without ambiguity either. We moved to the table. Service began. I stayed on the floor for the first course, visible but not hovering. My cousin sat across from her future in-laws and smiled the smile that didn't reach anywhere useful and said very little. Her fiancé spoke more than I had expected. He asked me, during the second course changeover, how long I had been operating the restaurant. I said 4 years at this location, 2 before that at a smaller space in North Charleston. He said, "That's impressive." He said it like he meant it. I thanked him. My cousin excused herself between courses. I was at the service station when she came up beside me. She said my name quietly, like she was trying to get my attention from across a library. I turned. She looked smaller than she had all evening. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Tell you what?" She said, "That this was yours, that you owned it." I said, "You didn't ask." She said, "But I would have." She stopped. I said, "What?" She said, "I would have done things differently." I said, "I know." I said it without anger, which seemed to confuse her more than anything else I'd said all night. She said, "Are you going to cancel the booking?" I said no. I said the evening would proceed exactly as planned, because that's what my staff had prepared for, and that's what the Aldridges deserved. She said, "And the payment situation?" I said, "You'll receive a standard invoice through the business account on Monday." She said, "But," I said, "it'll go through our normal channels." She said, "That's not what I said. It's exactly what's happening." She looked at me for a moment, and I watched something shift in her face. Not regret exactly, not yet, but the particular expression of someone who has been operating on an assumption and has just seen it removed. She went back to the table. Service continued. The Aldridges were warm and appreciative. Mrs. Aldridge asked Priya for a card before she left and said she had 2 events in the fall she needed a space for. Her husband shook my hand again at the door and said, "Your cousin is lucky to have you in the family." I smiled. I said, "Have a wonderful night." My cousin left without saying goodbye to me. Her fiancé, on his way out, paused at the door. He said, "For what it's worth, I didn't know about the financial arrangement she was trying to set up." He said, "I wouldn't have let her do that." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "I know." He nodded once and followed her out. I stayed at Oleander until close. I helped my closing team with the reset, which I didn't need to do but wanted to. I checked the cooler inventory, signed off on the waste log, turned the lights down in the dining room. Priya was the last one left besides me. She sat at the bar with her closing checklist and looked up when I came out of the kitchen. She said, "How are you doing?" I said, "I'm okay." She said, "You didn't have to be that calm." I said, "It was easier than the alternative." She said, "She's going to call you, you know." I said, "Probably." She said, "What are you going to say?" I thought about it for a moment. I said, "I'll say the same thing I said tonight." She said, "Which is what exactly?" I said, "The truth." In as few words as it takes, I drove home along the waterfront with the windows down. Charleston at midnight is one of those specific things, the water and the old buildings and the particular darkness that isn't quite silent because there's always something happening somewhere nearby. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. There was no heat in my chest, no satisfaction crackling around. What there was felt more like the absence of something. The absence of the weight I'd been carrying since the brunch in Savannah, since the printout with my name on it, since my aunt's voice saying, "You've always been the steady one." The weight had not transferred. It had just dissolved. That was different. My cousin texted me the next morning. Not a call, a text. It said, "I think we need to talk." I read it and set my phone down and ate my breakfast and took a shower. An hour later, I texted back one sentence. I said, "The invoice will come Monday. I have nothing else to add right now." She didn't respond. My aunt called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message saying she heard the dinner went very well and that the Aldridges seemed very impressed and that she hoped we could all sit down soon and talk through everything as a family. I listened to the message once and then deleted it without saving it. Not with anger. I want to be specific about that. It was a deliberate, quiet action. Like closing a window against the cold. Necessary and clean. My uncle texted me 3 days later. He said, "Your mother would have been proud of what you've built." That was all. I read it sitting at my desk between morning service and an afternoon vendor call, and I sat with it for longer than I expected. My mother had been gone for 6 years. My uncle had known her since they were children. He said very little about most things. I wrote back, "Thank you, Uncle David. That means a lot." I meant it completely. Oleander had its best month in May. We were fully booked for the next 3 weekends before the invoice had even gone out. Mrs. Aldridge's assistant called on a Wednesday and inquired about availability for a rehearsal dinner in October and a corporate event in November. Priya took the call and came to find me in the kitchen where I was working on a new entree with my sous chef. She said, "The Aldridges want to book 2 events." I said, "Find them dates." She said, "Both of them?" I said, "Both of them." She smiled and went back to her desk. The invoice was paid in full, 10 days after we sent it, from my cousin's fiancé's account rather than hers. I noted it without comment. My cousin posted something about a month later. No mention of the dinner, no mention of Oleander, no mention of me. It was a soft-lit video about pivoting, about knowing when to let things go, about the people who show up for you in ways you don't expect. The comments were full of people saying she was so resilient, and they loved her energy. I watched maybe 40 seconds of it, not because it bothered me, because I had genuinely run out of feelings about it, and that turned out to be the most useful thing I had ever lost. I had believed for a long time that being good to my family meant making space for the ways they fell short of me. I thought that absorbing the cost of their choices was what love looked like when it was practical and adult and unconditional. I thought silence was generosity, and patience was the same thing as strength. I don't believe that anymore. Not because my cousin humiliated herself in front of her future in-laws, not because the Aldridges were impressed, not because any of the external things landed the way they landed. I believe it because I stood in my own dining room on a Saturday night, and I didn't explain myself to anyone. I just told the truth in 3 sentences and let it stand. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was actually, finally, everything. So let me ask you something. Have you ever paid for something you never agreed to? Because saying no felt more expensive than just letting it happen? Have you ever watched someone hand you a bill for your own life and smiled and said you'd think about it? Tell me in the comments. I mean it, I want to hear where you're at with this, because I know I'm not the only one. And if this story landed somewhere real for you, stay with us. Type something below. Tell me where you're watching from. This channel is built for exactly this. The stories that don't get told at family dinners. The ones you carry home on the highway with the radio off. If that's you, you're in the right place. See you in the next one.